Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at tonight's Housing and Safety Elements Workshop. We're very happy that you're all here, and we expect more people to be joining us throughout the workshop. Before we get started, we want to make sure everyone knows that you have the opportunity to participate and listen to the workshop in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So I'm going to start by making the announcement in English, and then I will be followed by the 2 translators. So you'll be selecting the globe icon to choose the language you want to listen to for this meeting. And that will come up after all 3 people have spoken with the instructions. So now I'd like to introduce Luis Jewell, the Spanish interpreter, to make the announcement in Spanish.
Muy buenas noches. Gracias por acompañarnos esta noche. Es un placer tenerlos en esta reunión de elementos de vivienda y seguridad. Ciertas información que queremos darle. Esta reunión se está transmitiendo de manera simultánea en 2 diferentes idiomas a partir del inglés, que es el idioma natural. Luego se está traduciendo en español. Sí, por favor, abajo van a encontrar un globo de manera como que es el mundo. Ahí oprimen, ahí ustedes pueden escoger el idioma español que necesitan y ahí escucharán mi voz de manera simultánea, traduciendo todo, interpretando todo al idioma español. Muchas gracias. Gracias por acompañarnos. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. And now Kenny Trung is going to make the announcement in Vietnamese.
Chào mừng quý vị đến với cuộc hội thảo tối hôm nay về vấn đề nhà cửa cũng như về vấn đề hỏa hoạn trong thành phố. Cuộc họp tối hôm nay gồm có 3 ngôn ngữ. Quý vị nhìn kỹ bên màn ảnh phía bên tay phải là chúng ta có ngôn ngữ tiếng Anh, tiếng Tây Ban Nha và tiếng Việt. Quý vị nhìn thấy cái dấu hiệu quả địa cầu, quý vị nhấn vào đó và chọn ngôn ngữ Việt ngữ thì chúng tôi sẽ có thông dịch viên cho quý vị. Cảm ơn quý vị nhiều. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. And we're going to turn on the interpretation feature. Okay, please select your language. And there's also information in the chat as well. Okay, well, I hope we are ready to go. So now I would like to introduce Lily Thomas, the planning manager with the Marin County Community Development Department. Welcome, Lily.
Thank you, Joan. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming tonight. We are here to talk about housing and resiliency in our communities. And this conversation is based on the context of updating our housing and safety plans. However, it's really about us working together to make Marin a stronger and more sustainable place to live. Tonight's meeting will include a deep dive into the safety element and a briefer update on the housing element. And then we'll talk a little bit more about outreach we've done and ways for you to be involved as we move forward. I'd now like to introduce some of the team who is going to help the county plan to meet these challenges. So in addition to myself, we have Jillian Zeiger, Aline Tanillian, who work with me at housing. We have Leslie Lako and Jack Liebster, who work in the Community Development Agency on the safety side of the house. And then we have a consultant team who are working with us, including Veronica Tam, Barbara Beard, Joan Chaplick, Jose Rodriguez, Mirna Ortiz, and Anna Padilla. Now I'll turn it back to you, Joan, to go through the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Lily. And I'll be serving as the moderator and facilitator for tonight's meeting. So we'll do a quick review of the agenda and how the meeting is going to work tonight. Then we'll get you some information about the safety element and especially its role in helping the county respond to climate change. We'll be describing the vulnerability assessment, which is some of the key technical analysis that is done. And then we'll be showing you the atlas. So this is a preview of a tool that will allow you to learn information about your specific property in the county. We're going to give you an update on the housing element. Then we have upcoming outreach activities, and then we'll have next steps and closing comments. And so we'll be finishing up before 8 o'clock. In terms of ground rules, we ask that you submit your questions through the chat when we signal you. It helps the presenters and the team behind the scenes identify the best place to answer questions. Whenever possible, we will reply if it's a simple question, but we'll do our best there. Please respect others' opinions. We assume we're going to hear multiple viewpoints in the activities we do tonight. Be respectful in your comments in the chat. On the technology front, remember, it's unpredictable at times, so we request your patience and flexibility if it's needed. Feel free to keep your video on so we can stay visually connected. And just a reminder, this is just one meeting when there's a lot of outreach activities going on to give us additional input. Just want to remind you, we're going to be using the Zoom tools. So on your computer, looking for the chat, that'll allow you to submit your comments or questions, whether you're on a laptop or your phone. And there's also the raise hands feature. We will allow for public comment at the end. So you'll be able to raise your hand and we can identify you and your opportunity to speak. Throughout the meeting, we'd like to keep you engaged and involved as much as possible. So we have some polling questions to find a little bit about you and how these activities relate to your life. We have the chat feature with your comments and questions. So especially any questions and comments specific to the activities that we're doing will be most helpful. And then also after tonight's meetings, we're going to preview some outreach activities that we hope you will participate in as well. So let's get started. We have our Zoom poll, and we asked these questions at the first meeting, and we want to continue to ask them throughout so that we have a sense of who's participating. So I'm going to ask my colleague Anna to bring up our poll. So we want to get a sense of who's here tonight and where you live. So Anna, how about our first polling question? Okay, so we'd like to know where you live. Are you in unincorporated Marin County? Are you in one of the cities within the county? Or do you not live in the county? Or do you work outside? Do you live outside of Marin County but work in Marin? So please let us know where you live. And this also gives us a sense of how effective our outreach was. There were many things done to bring people to tonight's meeting. So, and we'd like to go through these questions pretty quickly, so we hope that you'll answer them as quickly as possible. Okay, so right now, Anna, if you want to share the results, we have about half of you live in a city within Marin County, about a third are from the unincorporated county, and then a few from outside the county, and a person who works here but lives outside the county. Okay, let's go to our next polling question. So our next question is, for those of you who live in unincorporated Marin, so if you could tell us what part of the county you live in. So Anna, if we could have our next polling question. So let us know where you are. And again, we'd like to get through these questions pretty quickly, but it's always helpful to know where people are coming from. And we recognize that about half of you didn't live in unincorporated Marin County, so we'll expect to see those answers as well. Okay, Anna, let's bring the polling to a close and we can share and let people know. Okay, we have pretty good coverage of the county, whether it's West Marin or unincorporated San Rafael, but different parts of the county have been covered. Okay, let's go to polling question number 3. So this question, we'd like to know where you work. So do you work in Marin County? Yes, no, or you may be someone who's retired, unemployed, or currently not working. Okay, just a few more answers to this question. Okay, Anna, let's bring this poll to a close. Okay, so we have almost, not quite 40% of you work in Marin County. So Anna, let's share those results. Okay, just to let everyone know who is on the Zoom with us tonight. So let's go to polling question number 4. So for this question, we want to know how long you've lived in Marin County, and that can be anywhere, whether it's one of the cities or unincorporated Marin County. So are you a relatively new resident who's been here less than a year, or 1 through 5, 5 to 10, 10 plus years, or you're someone who doesn't live in the county? Okay, Anna, how about if we share the results? Very interesting results here tonight. So those of you responding, with the exception of one person from outside the county, have lived here for 10 years or more. Okay, so let's go to our next polling question. And, you know, because we are working on the housing element, our next question asks us about your housing situation. So we'd like to know if folks participating own their home, do you rent your home, or do you live with family or friends? Okay, let's see. Okay, let's share those results. And so it looks like a little over half of you are homeowners, and then almost a third are renters, and then we have others who live with family and friends. So Anna, are we ready to go to question 6? And this is the last polling question before we dive into the content of tonight's meeting. So if you could give us your age, whichever category you fall into. Again, the results are anonymous, but it helps us understand who we have reached. Okay, so let's wrap up the polling and share the results here. So we have a pretty good age distribution, and then again with some longtime residents, we also have some older residents as well. So that concludes our polling. We do have some additional polling questions coming later in the middle of the presentation. So thanks for giving us that information. It's very helpful when we plan and organize these meetings. So we are going to be using the chat. So we'd like to give everyone just a chance to test out the chat. So we'd like you to enter what's one word that comes to mind when you think about climate change in Marin County. So if you could submit your comment in the chat, and we can read off a few of these things. So drought is one that has come in, vulnerability, water, inaction, flooding, fire, worry, emission, consumption, wildlife, flooding, multi-hazard, not enough has been done, wildfire again. Okay, well, thank you for your submittals. I'm glad to thank you for your responses, and also happy to see that the chat is working. And just a reminder that we save and download everything that's in the chat from these meetings. So with that, I think we're ready now to get moving forward on the presentation related to the safety element update. I would now like to introduce Barbara Beard. She's a senior environmental planner with MIG, and she's going to walk us through the safety element. Barbara?
Yes, thank you, Joan, for that introduction. And I'd just like to comment very quickly that this is a very interesting planning effort that the county is undertaking. There's so much information that's coming out now on climate change, and the safety element update process is really pulling together information from numerous sources and identifying where new policy is needed in the general plan. And I'd also like to just point out that as we talk about the various safety element hazards tonight, that it might be good to keep in mind that these hazards are already present in the county, and most of them are addressed in the general plan to some extent. It's just that recent state law is requiring safety elements to address them in more detail and to bring in resiliency planning related to climate change. So just sort of an introduction to the overall safety element update process. So the safety element is a portion of the county's general plan that contains policies that prepare for and protect the public from harmful impacts from environmental hazards. And these hazards could be wildfire or flooding, landslides, sea level rise, and all of the other ones that we are familiar with from living in the Bay Area. The policies are included in the Marin County General Plan, which is called, in Marin, it's called the Countywide Plan. Next slide, please. State law requires the safety element be updated every 8 years along with the housing element, which is why this process is occurring now. And the process for updating the safety element will include the preparation of a vulnerability assessment to describe the environmental hazards that will be made more severe by climate change. And it will also identify vulnerable populations and community assets that could be at increased risk. After the completion of the vulnerability assessment, the planning effort will identify new general plan goals and implementation plans so that the safety element meets the county needs and also will meet state requirements. Next slide, please. So the county has prepared a number of planning documents already that the safety element and the vulnerability assessment can rely upon. There's 2 documents related to sea level rise that the county has prepared. One is the Bay Wave project. It focuses on the Bayshore side of the county, and the Sea Smart sea level rise report focuses on the coast side. There's also the local hazard mitigation plan, the emergency operations plan, a climate action plan, and then the newer Marin County wildfire protection plan, and also an adaptation and land use planning guide. All will support the vulnerability assessment. The county has also completed a number of focused projects, and tonight Leslie Lako from the county's community development agency will be presenting a discussion of some of the efforts the county is undertaking.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so the documents that Barbara referenced really provide a lot of guidance and policy direction already for the county. Even though we are seeking more, we have used that to identify a number of projects that we could already move ahead on. We have a number of pilot projects, including some beach restoration projects like Aramburu Island, that's in Richardson Bay. So providing beach area really helps reduce some of the wave energy and erosion along the shoreline. Aramburu Island sits in front of a shoreline that has houses there. So it not only provides habitat, but protects the shoreline as well. We also were able to permit a state coastal conservancy project for an oyster reef off San Rafael Point. So that project involves putting a bunch of oysters together, sort of cabling them together and creating a reef. And that reef then attenuates wave energy that's heading towards the shoreline and prevents erosion of that shoreline to a pretty significant extent. So, and part of what they're looking at is to what extent is that, and how long will that last? So another great nature-based kind of solution that we've been pursuing is marsh restoration. So marshes also have the effect of reducing or attenuating wave energy. And of course, they provide great habitat as well. They act like sponges. All those sloughs that sort of meander through marshes really soak up a lot of water. So we have the McGinnis Marsh Restoration Project and a restoration project in Tuscarnia Marsh. We've also done restoration projects at, or been involved with restoration projects in other marshes as well along the Bay shoreline and in West Marin. We have a number of studies that we're also working on, including a number of studies about nature-based adaptation. These are all great ways to address sea level rise in the near future, as well as other types of flooding. Those include the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline Project, which looks at a number of sites in Tomales Bay and a number of different types of living shorelines or nature-based measures that can provide protection in those areas, such as beaches, but also tidal marsh and some native oyster restoration as well. And then we've also done a study for the Stinson Beach area looking at whether or not a dune system could provide protection for development and help feed that beach and keep it nourished with plenty of sand. So those are some of the interesting sea level rise projects that we've been working on. Countywide, you all voted in the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, and they've been moving quickly with a lot of projects. The first is the Zone Haven project, which is a project that helps evacuation in the event of an emergency. So I highly encourage you to go to the Zone Haven, the Marin County Zone Haven website, which you could just Google that and you'd find it very easily, and figure out what zone you're in and sign up for the alert system, and you will be notified where to go in the event of an emergency through that system. Some of the other work that the Marin County Wildfire Prevention Authority helps fund is work that the Marin County fire agencies and also Fire Safe Marin, the nonprofit organization, are doing, including the community wildfire protection plan that Barbara mentioned, which has really provided a lot of information for us so far in this project. The county also does a lot of work on mitigation, which generally means in the language of climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a climate action plan. We have a program called Drawdown Marin, which is really a community-led program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when I say community-led, I mean that community members have actually identified projects that are important to them. They've had them reviewed by a board, and in some cases even awarded Kickstart money to advance those projects. So it's a really excellent community-driven kind of project. There's also, with county support, but also through nonprofit organizations, the county is doing carbon farming through the Marin Carbon Project, which is really about using farming methods that help sequester carbon in the soil and in the plant materials, rather than some of the more industrial farming methods that release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So I know that's a lot, but it does help to know that there's work happening in the county. It's also good to know that the county is ahead of a lot of other counties on this, which is sometimes a challenge. So with all that, Barbara, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Leslie. The vulnerability assessment is a required part of the safety element update, and the state has been kind enough to offer guidance to all the communities throughout the state who are going through this exercise. So the State Office of Emergency Service has published the Adaptation Planning Guide, which presents a step-by-step process that communities can use to help plan for climate change. The vulnerability assessment follows the recommended content and structure, and It will include a discussion of the hazards that are exacerbated by climate change. It identifies vulnerable populations and vulnerable community assets. And then it will evaluate the county's ability to respond to the identified climate hazards. Next slide, please. The environmental hazards that are addressed in the vulnerability assessment are not new to Marin County. I think everyone is probably fairly familiar with all of the ones shown on the slide. Between drought, starting with drought and going to wildfire, they've all been present in the county for a long time, but the focus of the vulnerability assessment is how climate change would make them more severe and how they would impact county populations and facilities. Next slide, please. Joan, we're not hearing you at the moment.
There we go. Thank you for that, Barbara.
Yes, sure.
So we have 2 polling questions because we want to get a sense of these hazards as it relates to your experience. So our next polling question coming up is, we'd like to get a sense of the following hazards. So which have you experienced at your residence or your immediate neighborhood in the past 5 years? So we just want to get a sense of how far-reaching some of these are, whether it's flooding, landslide or subsidence, storm damage done to your residence. We know October there were some pretty damaging storms. You have the tree damage, tree loss, threat of wildfire, and well, we have a number with none of the above. So we're happy to hear that for you. So let's share these polling results so that others can see what people in the Zoom have experienced here. So yeah, flooding, threat of wildfire, and storm damage seem to be the ones where people have had the most experience. Okay, so let's go to our next polling question. And in this polling question, we want to get a sense of how you have been affected by extreme heat events. So, and your experience, so over the past 5 years. So let us know if they're not a problem for you, your home keeps you reasonably comfortable, or your home provides little relief. You might be someone who is forced outside, whether because of your job or your housing situation. We're curious if any of you have taken advantage of the cooling centers that have been offered by the county. Or we do have some folks that they have the ability to temporarily relocate during extreme heat. And we know that a few people have left to go to cooler temperatures, whether with family or other locations. So let's close this poll and we can share the results. And luckily in this group, we have a high percentage of folks who they achieve relative comfort at home. And we know that there's almost a third of you where your home situation does not quite provide the level of relief or comfort during extreme heat events. And the safety element is about, the county preparedness for these types of activities. So with that, Barbara is going to walk us through the environmental hazards that are described in the vulnerability assessment. And we're going to stop about halfway and we'll have an opportunity for you to share your experience and submit your experience, your issues and concerns in the chat. So let's get started with the first hazard, Barbara.
Thanks, Joan. Well, I think everybody has experienced the summer and fall where drought is on everybody's mind and in the media constantly. And I think that stems from the fact that for Marin County, 75% of the water source for Marin Municipal Water District is rainfall that is, coming from the Mount Tam watershed. And with climate models are predicting that rainfalls will change and we'll be experiencing longer, more intense periods of drought because the rainfall pattern will follow a more boom or bust type pattern where there'll be very wet years and very dry years. And, you know, the predictions are that droughts will become longer and more intense. I think Marin residents are also familiar with the localized flooding conditions that may occur in the county, as was most recently experienced just a couple of weeks ago. Generally, Marin watersheds are prone to flash flooding, and the county has 8 designated flood zones. You know, the climate models are predicting an increase in flooding in the future because of that boom and bust rainfall pattern. And the flooding could be, and is probably most likely going to be, made more severe by sea level rise for the bay shoreline and the coastal areas. So this is an example of a map that is going to be in the vulnerability assessment, showing the FEMA flood hazard zones for the entire county. And I know at this scale it's rather difficult and hard to read, but when the vulnerability assessment becomes available, people can dive in a little bit deeper. But the light blue areas are the FEMA 100-year flood zone areas, and the darker blue areas are the 500-year flood zone areas, with the 100-year flood being defined as a flood that has a 1% chance of being equal or exceeded in any given year. The 500-year flood is a flood that has a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year. And I think just the big takeaway message from this map is, you know, the eastern side of the county experiences flooding at the 100-year flood event, and it's definitely focused in the low-lying areas and where drainages enter the bay, and it affects all the major roadways and highways, you know, 101 and 37 and 580, and I think that's a situation people, you know, are fairly familiar with. So California defines an extreme heat event as an event where the temperatures are hotter than 98% of the historical high for a particular area. And because it's based on historical temperatures, you'll see a little bit of variation of what's defined as an extreme heat event based on the location of that particular area. For Marin County, the extreme heat is identified as being 94.5 degrees, which is rather specific, but that's the modeling predictions. And I think that temperature really does reflect the fact that Marin has historically had fairly low temperatures. So when we're talking about extreme heat in Marin County, we'll put it in context of, you know, a temperature expected to be around 94, 95 degrees. Extreme heat events do create serious health risks for vulnerable populations. Seniors, people with disability and chronic health conditions, people experiencing homelessness, and those who have to work outdoors are, you know, all impacted by heat events. And when the heat events don't cool down during the evening and there's no relief, you know, the vulnerable populations really do feel the effects of the temperatures. The prediction by the Bay Area, the Association of Bay Area Governments, is that on average we'll see 6 extreme heat events each year by the end of the century. Next slide, please. Marin has experienced landslides since the early days of development, and generally the landslides are triggered by heavy rainfall events and occur in the steep slope areas. With the predicted change in rainfall patterns, the frequency and number of landslides is expected to increase. And wildfire can also increase the potential for landslides by removing vegetation and changing soil chemistry, so that when rainfall does happen, the soil is more likely to not hold in place and to slip and cause either landslides or debris flows.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Barbara. And we're going to stop for a moment here. There were a few comments and ideas coming in through the chat, But now we'd like to give you a chance to zero in on these 4 hazards that Barbara has given us a brief preview of as they're described in the vulnerability assessment. And we'll have a good record here. So we'd like to hear your issues and concerns related to these hazards, whether we're talking about drought. We've already had a few comments come in related to flooding, then extreme heat, and landslides. So let's take a moment and we'll get your thoughts and ideas in the chat. Just a few comments there we've received about flooding already, but let's see what folks have to say, especially as it relates to their specific issues and concerns. So we'll give folks a chance to start responding. A couple of comments provided already about flooding, being able to capture rainwater during rainfall and store that in cisterns. About local ordinance, looking at the balance to need capture water and the need to provide for healthy streams. We have a comment about Marin City. In terms of flooding, it can cut off the city, which can be very dangerous. Then we also have concerns about inundation of septic systems. We do have a comment in the chat. You cannot access the whiteboard, but anything you submit through the chat will get added to the whiteboard by the team behind the scenes. We have a comment as it relates to about stop building in the WUI, and we're going to talk about that in the moment. That is the urban wildfire interface, and Barbara's going to explain more about that. Then we have a comment to keep our storm drains clear. So that's something that can help manage flooding. We want to provide more assistance to get people off of wood burning home heating and have them migrate to electric-based heat. Then we have a comment about drought. It's an endemic part of the historic climate of Marin. We should use native plants that survive dry summers. Okay, so we've gotten a few comments on drought. Let's see, in Point Reyes, because of the drought, our water table is so low and seawater from the bay has increased the saline in the water to very unhealthy levels. And we are having to get water from a delivery program. So we have people already experiencing some of these impacts. Okay, other comments. Has anyone have any comments related to landslides? Hopefully there's not too much experience with them. We do have a request, prescribe burns, please. Okay, we can add that to the board. And okay, well, you can continue to submit your ideas through the chat. We will capture them and put them on the whiteboard so that we can share the record with everyone. And in the meantime, let's go back to the presentation. And Barbara's going to continue with her issues and continue talking about these hazards. So let's talk about sea level rise. Barbara?
Thank you, Joan. The 2 documents that have been prepared by the county, the Bay Wave document and the Sea Smart document, contain a pretty exhaustive analysis of sea level rise based on the current modeling projections. Both of them have acknowledged the fact that sea level rise has already occurred to the extent that there's about a 4 to 8 inch rise in sea level conditions currently. Just an example of a modeling prediction, the 2050 model projections are for a 20-inch sea level rise, and then we can add different types of storm events on top of that to get sort of a worst case scenario. At the end of the century, with approximately 60 inches of sea level rise, it's predicted that approximately 10,000 buildings and 120 miles of roads could be subject to sea level rise during a 100-year storm event. If we go to the next slide, which shows an example map, it's got lots of nice colors on the small inset pictures on the right-hand side. But this is an example of a map from the Bay Wave document, and it is showing the southern portion of the study area. And it is showing different sea level rise scenarios with a 100-year storm surge. So the pink color is the near term, closest to our current date, so it's approximately 2030, and that would be projecting approximately 10-inch sea level rise with the 100-year storm surge. And then the yellow color would be the mid-century, approximately 2050 sea level rise scenario, which is 20 inches of sea level rise with the 100-year storm surge. And then the blue is the longer term end of century scenario with roughly 60 inches of sea level rise projected. So the inserts do show the details, but again, you can see that the low-lying areas of the county are impacted, the highways and transportation systems would be impacted, and the larger drainages entering the bay really show the effects going up into the drainage areas. As you know, the end of century blue color shows us the extent that sea level rise could go up into some of the drainages. So next slide. Severe weather is now part of a safety elements required content. So discussion of heavy rains, flash flooding, tidal flooding, and high winds will be included in the safety element. We have all experienced severe storms on a regular basis. It's nothing new, but with the projected increase in frequency and intensity of storm events, it's something that will become more prominent on the planning front in terms of preparing for and having response plans to more severe storm events. Subsidence is the gradual settling or sinking of ground because of the displacement of subsurface soil materials. And it is actually something that's happening along the Marin Bay shoreline. And there's examples of projects where buildings and foundations have needed repair because of subsidence. The relevance to the safety element is that with sea level rise, groundwater levels are expected to increase, and it will saturate new areas of soil, and it will increase the susceptibility of areas to subsidence, and it will become more prevalent and become something that people will need to plan more for. The Community Wildfire Protection Plan is a very comprehensive source of information on wildfire, and it is including these facts, which is 82% of the county's total land area is ranked as moderate to very high fire severity hazard, and 18% of unincorporated Marin is in the wildland-urban interface, which is, the acronym is WUI, but the wildland-urban interface is where the structures or development is either intermixed or immediately adjacent to undeveloped lands that are at risk of wildfire. But again, with all the other hazards, the wildfire hazard is predicted to increase because of increased temperatures and more frequent droughts. Next slide. And another example of a map that will be in the vulnerability assessment. This is the CAL FIRE's high fire hazard zone, where the light yellow color is moderate hazard, the medium orange color is high fire hazard, and the pockets of the very dark orange are very high fire hazard severity zones. And these zones are determined by topography, soil type, and vegetation type, among other things. And so you can see the pockets where topography, slope, and vegetation really do affect the areas that are predicted to be high and very high fire hazard zones.
Okay, so now it's your turn again to hear from you. So let's go back to the chat, and we've had a few things added since we went through our first pass. So we're seeking to hear about your issues and concerns and ideas related to severe weather, subsidence, wildfire. And so just to read off a few things that have come in since we last switched. We had a suggestion of studying successful methods for building in floodplains, as we may need to do more of that to reach the RENA numbers. And the RENA numbers has to do with our housing allocation that we're planning for. Then to draw down green and reduce greenhouse gases, reduce the number of cows since they're methane producers. Another comment, as we consider more housing, take into account areas subject to sea level rise and avoid building in these areas that are subject to increasing risk in coming decades. We have some resources offered by the county. There's a website that has a lot of information about GHG reduction. We have a suggestion to increase the use of e-bikes and other low impact electric vehicles to reduce traffic and exhaust fumes. Let's see where some of these are going. I want to make sure that you can at least see part of the board where there's some comments. And also that e-bike comment would require a significant capital investment and a challenge to the status quo priority given to cars and trucks. Then a suggestion to consider using some of the new infrastructure funds just signed into law to open the old train tunnels, Woodacre to Fairfax and Corte Madera to Mill Valley, provide a flat bike pedestrian route from Point Reyes Station to Sausalito. Great, well, lots of excellent ideas coming in here. Let's see, we want to mitigate severe weather impacts. The person is referencing wind, and do that by undergrounding utilities. Then we have a concern specific to sea level rise, and that has to do with the dispersion of toxic chemicals in soil. Okay. Any other comments, ideas, issues, suggestions that you want to submit in the chat and that we can have be part of our follow-up discussion? And again, everything that comes in through the chat, we download and save, and it goes to the team that is working on the technical analysis and these documents. Okay, well, I don't have anything coming in right now, so we're going to go back to the presentation, and we're going to keep moving here. And so Barbara's going to tell us a little bit more about the vulnerability assessment and additional steps in the safety element. So Barbara?
Yes, we can go. Perfect, thank you. Following the recommendations of the adaptation planning guide that was referred to earlier, the vulnerability assessment identifies populations within the unincorporated portion of Marin that would be most vulnerable and least able to respond to environmental hazards. And these population groups are in 5 main categories: financially constrained households, physically or socially isolated communities, persons with high outdoor exposure, racial or ethnic minorities with limited access to resources, and persons with limited mobility, chronic health conditions, or people that are dependent on others for services. We're still finishing drafting the vulnerability assessment, but some of the obvious takeaway messages I think that are fairly intuitive to everybody is income really is the predictor of how somebody can respond to an environmental hazard. So the extremely low and low income households are the least able to respond to climate change hazards because of the lack of financial resources, whether it be to evacuate, to fund an evacuation, or to retrofit a property or repair a home after a climate event affected their houses. Physically isolated households within the county may have no cell phone service, may rely on utilities that are limited and possibly prone to damage from storm events. They may be in a very remote area with difficult evacuation routes. So households that are physically isolated are considered vulnerable to a number of the environmental hazards the vulnerability assessment addresses. Additionally, households where there's limited, the English language being a barrier, which could hinder receiving vital communications, is also a population that could be very vulnerable. Next slide, please. The unhoused population and people experiencing homelessness, of course, have very, very limited financial resources and may be unable to limit their exposure to weather conditions and possibly have limited mobility in an evacuation situation. And likewise, populations with limited physical mobility really are vulnerable to climate events and possibly unable to evacuate without any kind of assistance. Next slide, please. The vulnerability assessment will also look at community assets, an asset being anything that is of value to the community that the community relies upon. So there's the broad category of infrastructure, including roads and transit facilities, airports, railroads, utilities of all kinds, public buildings that provide services to county residents. There's also key services, and then natural and managed resources are also included. Natural resources being ecosystems and biological resources that are valued within the county, and managed resources would be farmland or other producing land that is part of the county. And economic drivers really that are focusing on land-based economic drivers that would be impacted by climate change hazards, agriculture, recreation because it's a tourism-based thing, and the health and vitality of parklands. Next slide, please. So essentially, every type of community asset would be impacted by one or more of the environmental hazards. And I think from the maps we've seen tonight that wildfire is the potential to impact a large part of the county. Sea level rise would be focusing along the coastline, but because the community assets are ones that people would use regardless of where they live in the community, sea level rise is a concern to everybody. Drought would have direct impact on natural and ecosystem-based resources and the financial impacts to utilities and key services. And flooding, landslides, and subsidence will continue to impact the assets that are located in those areas that are prone to them. So the next steps will be to complete the vulnerability assessment and begin work on developing the safety element policies and implementation programs. The wildfire section of the safety element is submitted to CAL FIRE for review and approval. And after that CAL FIRE approval, the draft safety element would be available to the public, and we're anticipating that to be in the spring of 2022.
Okay, well, thank you, Barbara. So we'd like to stop now and take your questions. So if you want to type your questions in the chat, whether it's Barbara or Leslie or other county staff that are here with us tonight, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. We've also had a number of additional suggestions in the chat that we'll be capturing. We have a comment about considering an alternative to air conditioning. So looking for other means of controlling indoor temperatures using insulation, airflow, building orientation. We have a comment that some of the physically isolated populations are also some of the wealthiest, and they have the means to repair or move elsewhere. We have some comments about heat waves becoming more common Therefore, multi-unit project design guidelines should include air conditioning so that people are comfortable. And we also have a number of ideas about, as it links to the housing element, prevent and mitigate the indirect impact of wildfires, primarily regarding air quality. So some comments about housing design needs to include HVAC systems, thinking about family child care providers. For example, those who work at home, the impact of bad air quality can be very difficult. So again, we really appreciate all of the ideas that you're submitting to us tonight. So are there any questions? I haven't seen anything come in through the chat. And I do appreciate the staff that were responding to questions as they came in throughout. Okay, well, we can stop periodically, and if questions come up, we can get them answered. So now we'd like to shift gears a little bit and introduce you to the Atlas. So I'm sure when Barbara showed those two maps that many of you were trying to locate your home or your business, and now we're going to share a tool with you that's going to have this information readily available. So I'd like to introduce Jose Rodriguez from MIG, and he's going to, we have 2 slides describing the Atlas, and then he's going to do a demo.
Well, thanks, Joan. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the Atlas. And just to let you know, the tool is just not available yet. We're aiming to get this thing out before the end of the month. So look out for it. So what is the Atlas? What's the purpose of the Atlas? So the Atlas is really, it's going to be an online mapping website. It's powered by Google Maps. So if you're familiar with using Google and locating businesses or your home on Google Maps, it's powered by Google. And really it's meant to zoom in. You can zoom in into a lot of the unincorporated areas, the county areas, and turn off different layers on and off related to the safety element and the housing element. The Atlas is divided into 4 key themes. One is the community profile, and it really includes demographic and census information and really paints the picture of a particular community. Another theme is what's called the physical and community infrastructure. Barbara kind of mentioned some of the key assets, but it really identifies electrical lines, pipeline networks, and other major infrastructure components in the county. There's a hazards theme, and as Barbara alluded, there's wildfire mapping, flood zone mapping. There's a lot of data related to some of the natural hazards in Marin County. And then lastly, there's a natural resources tab that really focuses on some of the open space protection areas, various natural resources and other areas that really there's a lot of in Marin County. Next slide, please. This is a quick snapshot of the Atlas, but it's really kind of hard to see what's going on here. So with that, I'm going to do a quick live demo. I'm going to share my screen here at the moment, and let's take a look at the Atlas itself. So as you log into the Atlas, there is several paragraphs that describe the summary, the purpose of the Atlas, what it's meant to do. As soon as you click on the Explore map, there's really briefly three key things that you can start to do on the Atlas. There are the, choosing your mapping theme. As I mentioned earlier, there's the community profile, physical and community infrastructure, hazards and natural resources. And then you can turn off the layers on and off. So if you scroll over to the right and scroll down, you can turn layers on and off. And actually, as you click on the layer itself, there's a little legend. And you can click on a small little check mark there, and it provides more information of that particular layer. There's a nice photo, a little bit of a description of what that layer or what that mapping layer is showing you, and then the source of the information. let's see, another key thing on the atlas is you're going to be able to type in your address and zoom in to a particular layer. So why don't we do that? I'm going to go over to the natural resources tab, and it's going to load up here. Give me a sec. All of a sudden my internet went slow. Okay. So natural resources, we're showing protected open space. As I mentioned, you can zoom in, and you can also select the satellite layer. Again, very familiar. If you're familiar with Google Maps, a lot of the same buttons and technology and zooming in, and you also have the little character to do street view on the map as well. So if I were to type in an address, I'm going to type in a public facility. Let's see if I can type this correctly. Avenue. And we're going to go to the Woodacre community, and I'm going to zoom in. And I was zooming in, and so you can see you can zoom in pretty close, similar to Google Maps. And I zoom out a little bit, you can see this is still the public, the protected open space. And so it'll give you the name of the protected open space. We can zoom in and look at important farmland, and that will show on the map. You can click on those as well and get a little bit of more information. And as I mentioned, there is a legend, and you can click on the question mark, and it'll give you, again, more information on what is the important farmland layer. Let's see, there's other layers. There's the ridge and upland greenbelts layer. And so you can see as you turn the layers on and off, they'll appear. You can turn them off. You can zoom back and forth. There's a stream layer. So as I turn the stream data on, you can see various streams within this particular neighborhood. And so that gives you an idea of how you can zoom in and out of the map, look at different layers. And eventually we are going to add a new tab down the road where we'll be able to combine some of these layers. So we can, again, the importance of the mapping exercise is really to look at some of the data in terms of the housing element and the safety element. So with that, Joan, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, there's a question here. There's a person who wants to know, will it also include racially concentrated areas of affluence as designed by HCD? So when that's the state agency overseeing the housing element. So I'm curious, are there demographic layers in here?
Absolutely. So we do have some HCD data. So we do have the minority population data, which really looks, if you combine all of the different racial and ethnic groups, and that will map the data. We do have other HCD data, which is the Housing and Community Department that overviews the housing element. We have data with population that has a disability, overcrowded households. And as I mentioned, we're still making the final tweaks to the map. We're going to have an income category. There is also, for those who are familiar with environmental justice, there is a Cal EnviroScreen tab as well that identifies where some of the pollution burdens are within Marin County, and some of the population and socioeconomic data associated with that. And so, yeah, once this site comes live, there's definitely a lot of mapping layers that you can turn on and off. And I believe this site will be available on the county's website under the housing elements and safety element web pages. There'll be links to this, to the atlas.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Jose. So thanks for that preview. So probably about the end of the month, you'll be getting notification if you're signed up to receive information from the county's housing and safety element website. There are regular messages that come out when there's new information there. So let's see. Now we'd like to bring you up to date on the housing element. So now I would like to introduce Veronica Tam from Veronica Tam Associates, and she is the housing expert who is helping us to complete the housing element. So Veronica?
Great, thank you, Jen. Just give you some idea about the relationship between the housing element and the safety element. You've heard a lot throughout the whole night about safety element. Both elements are integral components of the general plan. They're certainly related. And when we talked about the housing element and the safety element together, the most critical area that we looked at is the sites. Where are we going to have new housing in order to meet our regional housing needs assessment? So in doing the housing element, certainly the atlas is going to help, and Jose's whole work about identify areas with constraints and hazards. Those are the areas that we will try to avoid in putting a lot of new housing in there. So that's how the housing element and safety element would be kind of related together. We certainly will be looking at some of the new requirements like sea level rise, high fire hazards, and whether some of the extreme conditions will be impacting some of the areas, and try to avoid putting a lot of new housing in those areas. Next slide. So far, just to give you an update on what we have been doing as part of the housing element, the county is certainly taking a very proactive approach in outreaching to the community and trying to get an understanding of the nature and extent of housing needs in the unincorporated areas. So far, we've met with focus groups that relates to renters and homeowners, community-based organizations. We have also conducted the first community workshops just to give an idea, an overview of what is the housing element, what are the requirements, what are the components of the housing element, and how we're going to kind of like the process going through in developing the housing element. We have also met with the employee affinitive group. We have met with other community stakeholders. We will be doing, we have also done design review board presentations relating to the housing element. So these are some of the things that we have accomplished so far, but there are a lot more that we need to do. Next slide. So far, what have we heard? In the first workshop, what we have heard is that housing is definitely too expensive in the unincorporated areas, and mostly housing cost burdens impact the home renters more compared to the homeowners. Homeowners do have another option in the event that housing becomes too burdensome in terms of cost. You do have the option of becoming a renter, but the renters, there are no other options when you have the housing cost burden. And that's why when we talked about housing affordability, a lot of times the attention focuses on renters, but that doesn't stop there. We certainly want to look at affordable home ownership opportunities for some of the workers and younger first-time home buyers in the unincorporated areas. For sale home prices currently are definitely too high. It's not reachable. Home ownership is not reachable for a lot of the low and moderate income folks who live or work in an unincorporated Marin County. We have also heard that people have experienced housing discrimination in the housing market. There are unfair kind of treatments or requirements to renters. And there are also, the housing discrimination is certainly more prevalent in certain housing types, most likely in the multifamily housing situation. But all of this is really related to the other comments that we heard from people who participated in the first workshop, that there's not enough housing supply. And the short, kind of like a shortage in new housing units is a condition that makes it more likely that you see housing discrimination, because there is that propensity to discriminate and pick the most particular groups that you would want to consider as most desirable as your tenants. And I think having that discussions about housing discrimination and housing affordability cannot ignore the fact that there is not enough supply in the unincorporated areas. Next slide. So we will be continuing more outreach because outreach is probably one of the most important components of the housing element. we are having a housing needs survey that's available online and in print in English, Spanish, and also Vietnamese. There will be also additional developer roundtables to kind of understand the constraints and opportunities in the unincorporated areas relating to expanding housing supply in the area. We will have more workshops in the future, particularly focusing on sites inventory and then programs and actions in the future. Next slide. Well, these are all going on when kind of getting input from the community. We are also at the same time assessing the existing conditions relating to housing needs from more empirical data. We're looking at housing needs assessment based on demographic and housing socioeconomic changes in the unincorporated areas. We're also looking at market conditions and what are the trends in the market conditions. The other thing that we are looking at also is what has the county accomplished in implementing the current housing element, which is set to expire January 31st, 2023. And overall, the county has been able to meet its regional housing needs allocation for the current cycle. But most of that accomplishment focuses on the above moderate income units, but certainly fell short in the units that are affordable for lower and moderate income households. And you'll see that in the next slide. As you can see, the regional housing needs allocation for the current round of the RHNA is only 185 units. That's very limited and compared to what we have to do today. But we have met already, even though we're about 60 or 70% into the planning period, we have met the RHNA in terms of the overall number, but we're not meeting the RHNA in terms of income categories. We've met only 75% of the affordable range, but we've met 280% of the above moderate income. Now, this 185 unit RHNA is certainly very limited compared to the challenge that we are facing today with the 6th cycle housing element. The RHNA is estimated at about 3,600 units. Next slide. So in the upcoming months, we will be doing, Jose and we'll have the fun job and all of us too as the consulting team to try to meet the challenge. How are we going to identify potential sites for the regional housing needs allocation? The challenges are we have very limited available vacant land. So we will have to rely on reusing underutilized properties. So what would be considered underutilized properties and where would those be? How do we do that and avoid the environmental constraints or to some extent mitigate the environmental constraints? And most of all, housing is expensive in Marin County. How do we do that? How do we provide affordable housing and choices for our residents and also workers in the unincorporated areas? Next slide. So with that, I pass back to Joan. She's going to talk about the future outreach and engagement opportunities in updating the housing element and the safety element.
Okay, well, thank you, Veronica. You're not off the hook yet. We want to give people some time to ask any questions that they might have. We've gotten, there was a comment that came in before Veronica started to consider using some of the south-facing slopes in Marin open space for substantial solar panel installations. So the person identifies it as a tough choice, but what is the greater good? Reducing dependence on carbon-based energy versus the natural beauty. So we're getting a lot of ideas and things to think about. So let's see if we have any questions related to the update on the housing element. Or any comments from the staff or consultant team that we want to add.
I just want to reiterate, this is Jillian Zeiger. I'm in the Housing and Federal Grants Division at the Community Development Agency. And we want to make the point that people should not expect us to exclude housing from potentially hazardous areas, but rather to design such housing appropriately to make it safe.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. Okay, so let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions. So we have a question. Is there a map of suitable sites available for public review that the county has identified? And we're definitely not there yet. And Jillian is, in just a moment, she's going to give a schedule, and that'll give you some sense of when you'll be able to see that. So we have Jillian Zeiger. She's a senior planner with the county, and she's going to walk us through the outreach activities and engagement opportunities that are coming up.
Thanks, Joan. I'm actually going to hand this over to Lily Thomas, and I'm going to take questions.
Thank you, Jillian and Joan. So as you can see, the timeline that we have here, we are in the fall of 2021. We've been holding the meetings and the workshops that Veronica mentioned earlier. So we have been really focusing around housing need currently, as well as the safety element. And then the question that somebody asked about sites is very relevant and timely, because that's kind of the next phase that we'll be focusing on. We have an upcoming workshop with the board and the Planning Commission on the 12th of December, and we'll be focusing on looking at sites, as that we'll be starting a sites conversation with the board at that point. And that will go through winter and the spring of next year. And then once we do have that list that was asked about, we will start our environmental review of both the housing and safety element. And that will be, again, late winter, early spring of next year. And then we'll be continuing drafting the housing and safety elements and any zoning amendments necessary. And that will be happening in spring and summer of next year, followed by additional public review with state agencies and local agencies, in addition to continuing with public review. And then in the fall, we'll be going back to the Planning Commission and the board for their consideration. And then at each of these steps, every phase will have opportunities for the public to be involved in a variety of different ways that we'll talk about later. Next slide, please. So one of these opportunities that is available right now is the survey that Veronica mentioned, that's available in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. It's on our website. And this focus is around housing need, but there'll be additional opportunities for commenting on other parts of the housing element. We do encourage everyone to take this. You don't have to be in the unincorporated part of the county, but we do encourage everyone to take it. Next slide, please. Another tool that we'll be working on is the Consider It dialogue. And instead of doing a survey for safety, what we're doing is using this Consider It tool, which will, and some of the opportunities for doing this or some of the opportunities that we'll be doing on Consider It is, using this as a tool where we can look at opportunities, where you can weigh in around threats and concerns and opportunities in your neighborhood. Next slide, please. Will also be, it can also be a tool for evaluating how prepared you are in an emergency. Next slide, please. And then finally, we'll be using it again later in the process to weigh in on some housing discussions. That Consider It is on our website. So please take an opportunity to, once it's up, it'll be available for people to weigh in on. Next slide, please. Finally, here are some additional opportunities that will be coming soon for you to get involved in or to hear about. Consider it, which I mentioned, the presentations to design review boards, actually we have already done, so that has been checked off, but we do have the Planning and Board Commission, or Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors presentation on the 7th of December at 2:30 or thereafter. And that will be a conversation where they are really giving staff direction around principles of how we can meet our regional housing need within the constraints that we have discussed earlier. We'll have some additional workshops in January, and then we'll have another tool called Balancing Act, which is where you can be directly involved in selecting possible ways to where we can accommodate housing in our community and ways to do that. Next slide, please. All right, I'll turn it back to you, Joan. Thank you.
Okay, so before we move to public comment, just want to see if there's any questions on any of the outreach activities or the schedule, anything that Lily just walked us through. And we'll have time if any questions come up. But we do want to offer the opportunity for public comment. We know in this format that we never know how many people we're going to get, and we want to get your ideas. So we've used digital tools, but we also want to give people a chance to speak with the group. So if you'd like to make a comment and speak verbally to the group, just raise your hand and I can call on you, and then you'll have 2 minutes. A timer will come up. And again, you can be sharing your ideas. There's a question here. I'm going to ask the team, can we provide public comment through email? And if so, what is the best email to address, to send their comments to? So I'm wondering if Aileen, would you be able to drop that into the chat for everyone?
Yeah, we have one housing element email and safety element email, so I'll provide both in the chat.
Okay, great.
Joan, we have a question about housing that I'll read aloud, and Lily will be able to answer it. Okay. Regarding possible home key acquisitions, would those units count towards our RENA goals?
Yes, they could. Yes, they could. So, you know, if the project was located in the unincorporated part of the county, they would count towards ours. And if they were in one of the cities or towns, they would count toward their regional housing need. And just to make note that those are home key would be an extremely low income units, which are some of the hardest for communities to meet that need.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Are there other questions that have come in? I know we've gotten, there's a comment here regarding in Western Marin. It's a lengthy comment. I'll give it a quick highlight. To consider allowing backyard cottages to use electric or composting toilets and gray water systems that don't impact existing septic. Then we have an idea of utilizing new innovations in modular construction, solar panels, airflow, insulation to make comfortable housing that reduces cost and impact on utilities. It would require a revisit to building codes and ordinances, but perhaps it's time to take another look at these constraints. Okay. Other comments or questions here. So we have the email addresses for comments. We have the website here at the lower right-hand corner of every slide. That is the best place to get additional information. Is there anyone who'd like to speak? We do have a question that's specific to SB 9 and SB 10, which is recent state legislation that passed. And I'm wondering if county staff could respond. The person wants to know, has the county identified how many possible units of housing can be as a result of this legislation?
We have not done an analysis of that yet. There's still still a lot to figure out with that new legislation. You know, as is typical with state legislation, it's a little convoluted, and there's still, you know, attorneys who are kind of figuring how we're going to you know, interpret it and figure out how to work within those frameworks. But it's something that we're looking at. The Turner Center, which does a lot of research on housing policies, has projected what they think the number of units are, and we can make that available, and they have kind of done a prediction of how many units they think could result, and it was much fewer than kind of were expected, but we will be evaluating that, and also we'll be getting some guidance from HCD about how to use SB 9 and 10 to, you know, as we're accommodating our regional housing need.
Okay, thank you for that, Lily. So we have a request to comment, Erica Erickson. So if you would like to speak, and we just ask that you keep your comments to less than 2 minutes. And let's see, we just need to.
Okay, got it.
There she is. Okay, go ahead, Erica.
Thank you. Hi. I have a question and a comment. So for the housing element, I know that we have a multi-unit project guideline for new developments. And my suggestion would be to incorporate childcare, some units that are appropriate for family childcare providers in multi-family or multi-unit projects. There are some examples of affordable housing development that include that, like some in Los Angeles, for example. I think that being housing and childcare, two of the major needs of families, I think that would be a great thing we can do to advance the supply of childcare in our communities. And then I have a question that perhaps Lily can answer. I served on the Planning Commission some years ago, but I forgot. What are the some examples of actions that the county takes after we approve the sites and for housing development and plan the arena numbers? What are some of the actions that the county takes to motivate, support, foster affordable housing developments in our community? Do we work with affordable housing developers? Do we offer some incentives? What's in the, I didn't read the current around housing element, but what are some examples that are there of things that we do as a county to motivate the production of units, especially affordable ones, after the sites are identified and approved as part of the housing elements? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Erica. I'll try to answer that end of that question. So some of the things, you know, one of the main ways to support affordable housing is to have funding available to provide that local match. Because as you know, most funding for affordable housing comes from state and federal tax credits. But to be competitive for those, we need to have local housing dollars to match them. And the county has a housing trust fund, which is kind of prioritizes projects that are located in the unincorporated county, but can also fund within any of the cities and towns. And that has primarily, you know, funds in it that have been transferred by the board. Recently, we have a little over $10 million currently, so that's available. We also have, as you know, we have some federal grant dollars that are earmarked for affordable housing. So there's a variety of funding sources that are used. In addition, staff who work for the county, including Jillian and myself and Aline, when there are affordable housing developments, we are here to kind of support and walk them through the process and be just kind of a facilitator that can help support those things. And that is part of the work that we do. But really, most of that work is done through the housing element, where, and it's quite different than it was when you were on the Planning Commission and we did a housing element then. The requirements are quite a bit more stringent from the state's perspective. And you really need to have a site that is to include it in the housing element. It really needs to have a high likelihood of development within that planning period. And you really need to set the table so that those sites are ready for developing. And again, to remind people that the housing element is about housing at all income levels. Most of the interest in our community is really around the affordable housing, because that's where we have the hardest time meeting it, and we have a dearth there, but it does include housing at all income levels.
Okay, thanks, Lily. So Erica, anything else? You have 2 seconds left in comment, but you know, we have a very manageable size group tonight. So if there's anything else you want to add, or if you want to submit anything through the chat, you're welcome to. Okay, thank you, Erica. So our next commenter is Alan Wheeler. So just give us a second, we'll reset the clock, and we'll take you off mute so that you can speak with the group. Okay, let's see. Okay, Alan, you should be able to speak. Please go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for these fine presentations. They've been really informative. I really appreciate everyone's time, and I really appreciate this opportunity to attend. I'm on the Housing Advisory Committee for Housing and Safety, for what that's worth. And we've met a few different times, and I know some people on this call have heard me speak about these things before. So you'll probably see a lot of my comments, and just to sum it all up, if I can, it seems to me that there's a lot of things that are being juggled together. There's our legacy of open space and our tradition of agricultural set-asides and a number of other things that set aside land. There's the building codes and other ordinances that have been in place for a long time. There's new ordinances. There's a stream ordinance, which is in place, or not in place, under consideration. There's our need for more affordable housing. There's just all these different legacies are all sort of stacking up on each other now. And I'm wondering what people are thinking about how to prioritize some of these things. It just doesn't seem to me that all of these things can be number one. We have to think about how to dovetail all of these different priorities, including the disaster preparedness, which we did such a great job of covering. So it's not that there's an answer. What I'm interested in hearing people's perspective on is, where do we go from here to balance all of these constraints and still find a way to provide more affordable housing, especially for the people in most need. And so that's what I have to say, and thank you again.
Okay, Alan, thank you for your comment. And I'm just wondering if there's any maybe staff reply of how that balancing is approached or considered.
I would just say thank you, Alan, for your service on that committee. I think that is the question of not just the night, but the question that we'll all be focusing on. And we will be asking the board for guidance around just that question, is how, asking them to give us some guidance around what are the principles and their priorities that they would like us to use as we're evaluating and recommending sites.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Is there anyone else who would like to speak, or are there any questions that we may have missed that still need to be responded to?
Joan, there was one about affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I'm wondering if Veronica is still on, if she could take the question. It was about how will the county be meeting its affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements.
Okay, and Veronica, and if you could, this question asker, I think, is very well informed and knows all the jargon and everything. So if you could give a little refresher on what AFFH is and then respond to that question.
AFFH stands for Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. It's a new requirement under the Housing Element Law, which we have to, as part of the housing element, look at the existing conditions relating to a variety of fair housing factors, such as concentration of poverty and racial and ethnic concentration of your residents. We have to look at how the distribution of households with housing cost burdens. We also need to look at displacement risks. Another thing that we need to look at is how your population, particularly those are more vulnerable, the lower income and the disadvantaged groups, are impacted by access to resources and also environmental hazards. So those are some of the conditions, existing conditions that we have to look at as part of the housing element. So this housing element, how is it different from the current housing element? We're going to have an entire section that look at the existing conditions. More importantly, we have to look at, as we are planning for new housing growth and new housing units in the unincorporated areas, how do we do it in a way that would facilitate a better distribution of access to resources and opportunities with respect to all these factors? How do we disperse low-income population or housing so that they have the opportunity to be located in other parts of the unincorporated areas so they're not concentrated? How do we foster housing types so people not only have mobility choices, but they also have types of housing that they can choose? So in looking at the sites inventory and identifying sites, and I think one of the commenters talked about all these competing and interests. The difficult task is also to balance all of these and try to have an equity when we are looking at the regional housing needs allocation. When we're looking at site information, we need to have to look at it, balance it from the lens of equity. So ultimately, the housing element in furthering affirmatively furthering fair housing also has to have a set of meaningful actions, not only from building housing, but also what are we going to do to foster housing choice and mobility within the unincorporated area. So that's going to be a very key component of your housing element and new requirement in your housing element.
Great. Well, thank you, Veronica. Is there anyone else who would like to speak as part of public comment? Let's see. Well, we have a question that came in. Maybe Lily or Jillian can answer this. How do we plan to incentivize developers to build truly affordable housing?
I would say that, one of the ways that we'll do that is through the housing element, having policies in place, having zoning that is appropriate to accommodate affordable housing. So you need to have sites that are zoned multifamily at a density that makes it feasible to develop affordable housing. And then in addition to that, I would say we have the funding available that I talked about a few minutes ago. And then, I think that that's part of the job of the housing element is to, in addition to identify sites, to identify any barriers that we may have to developing a housing at all income levels, and then have programs and policies that address any of those identified barriers. So that sounded a little jargony, but I guess that what I'm trying to say is that we will identify kind of what's keeping us from being more successful in developing affordable housing, and then have some policies and ways to support affordable housing. And that's part of the job of the housing element.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So does unincorporated Marin County have any affordable housing overlay zones?
We do have a few. We have an affordable housing zone, which allows affordable housing at a higher density than if it was a market rate. So, and we have a couple of different zones that allow that. But I think that that's something that we'll be looking at. I don't know, Veronica, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think as part of the strategy for identifying sites, we may explore housing overlays and then affordable housing overlays, expanding it in certain areas. But that's certainly something that we will be exploring as part of the sites inventory strategy.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. Do we have any other questions or anyone who wants to make a public comment, who wants to speak with the group? We really appreciate everyone's interest in the topic and all of your participation so far. But it looks like we're wrapping up here. So I'm not seeing anything else come in. So I think we're ready to wrap it up, Lily. So I'd like to turn it back to you for some closing comments for the group.
Sorry to interrupt. We got one more comment. This was a direct message.
Okay.
A question. Is land cost a factor in site selection for affordable housing development?
It absolutely is. The cost of land is one of the reasons it's so difficult to develop here. The high land cost definitely makes it more challenging. One of the things that makes it more challenging to develop affordable housing. And so the way to address that high land cost is to have sites that are zoned at a density that's high enough where you can spread that cost across, multiple units. Another way to offset that high cost is through having local housing trusts funds and other local funds available. But yes, land cost as well as labor costs are two significant barriers, as well as, how long it might take a project to get through the entitlement phase. Those are usually some of the typical barriers that we hear about.
Okay, thank you. Erica, is your hand still up, or do you have a question for us in the chat? No, you're okay? Great. Okay, thank you. You would like to ask a question, yes? Okay, let's take Erica off mute for another question.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding preservation of housing, right? Talking about affordable housing that Lily was talking about. Is the Golden Gate Village as the main public housing, family public housing in Marin? Is it included in the housing element? And then the preservation of it? And then the other question too regarding Marin City, I saw in the chat, Tijuana asking about how we are engaging the community, especially regarding the effects of climate change in the community. So if you could please address that too. I may have missed the answer because I changed from cell phone to the laptop. I would love to hear that if possible.
So why don't I answer the first part of your question, and then I think Leslie will answer the second part of the question, or maybe Jillian if she needs some backup on it. So the first part was about whether the Golden Gate Village, the public housing, the family public housing would be included in the housing element. And the housing element is really about is primarily focused about adding additional housing units, but there is a section where you look at any loss of affordable housing that you might have. And so you evaluate that by looking at any affordable housing that may have expiring deed restrictions. Some, tax credit projects, for example, might have a 30-year deed restriction. And if they're coming up to the end of their deed restriction, then you need to evaluate those units. And the housing element requires you to have an analysis about what you're going to do about any expiring deed restrictions. So that's what you do as far as evaluating units that might be at risk of loss. The Golden Gate Village, because it is, it's restricted by how the federal government, the funding source through HUD, it is not considered have an expiring deed restriction. So it's not in that evaluation. Of course, making sure that your existing affordable housing is maintained adequately is part of the work that we do, but it's not a specific kind of component of the housing element, if that answers your question. And then about the second part of your question was about Marin City and addressing the flooding and other impacts that are in that community. Leslie, are you able to take that, or Jillian, do you want to?
I can talk a little bit about Marin City, and Jillian, feel free to jump in whenever you want. So there is flooding risk in Marin City, and one of the projects that there's a number of projects that are in the planning phase at Marin City. Some of them are plans to update the community plan. Some of them are public works projects. One of them that is an engineering related one is to improve the drainage from Marin City now. So where it drains to the bay, there's some issues with tide elevation and where those pipes are located now. So that's something that they're in the engineering phase of now. And then I think I put in the chat earlier that there actually are 2 other county sponsored projects, and both Jillian and Liz Darby are working really hard to coordinate across departments to make sure that there aren't redundancies and that they can make sure there's good public outreach when those projects get going. I think you also put a question here in the chat about wildfire risks and sea level rise and how they factor into the identification of suitable sites. And I'll just say once again, kind of reiterate what Jillian had said, that one of the reasons that we're doing the safety element along with the housing element is to make sure that the housing we do build is safe housing, which doesn't mean that the housing won't happen in places where there are hazards or where there will be hazards. If you think about California being a place where we have earthquakes, and we've had earthquakes for many years, we build near faults all the time. And for the most part, we have developed codes and ways of building that are pretty safe, given the hazard that's there. So part of updating the safety element, part of working on hazards in general, is finding ways to live with them and to develop safely near them. So with flooding, you elevate homes sometimes. Sometimes that's not appropriate in a specific location. There's other strategies that could be.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. There was a question from Tijuana about what 2 projects are happening in Marin City. So just a little bit more specific information on those projects.
I'll let Jillian take that then.
We're still in the planning phase for these projects, but once we have the specifics, we are definitely going to talk to the people of Marin City.
Okay, so the projects will be getting more specific. And just a comment from Erica, the fact that Marin City has only one road that serves as the entrance and exit for residents should be considered a major obstacle to the construction of additional housing units. Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Jillian said, there isn't any specific projects, developments proposed in Marin City. We're just trying to think about what resources are available to support those kind of issues that have been brought up, the flooding and other infrastructure needs in the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that clarification, Lily. Okay, any final comments or questions? Okay, I think this time, Lily, you get to bring it on home and give us some closing remarks. We have the website up you'll get notified of additional information. So Lily.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks everybody for your participation. We really have appreciated having you here and have this dialogue. I would encourage you to go to the website if you haven't already. There's a lot of information available there. You can also sign up to get notices of any upcoming events that we may have. And again, I would like to thank you for your commitment to being involved in your community. I hope that the workshop was useful and provided you a good overview about housing and safety element updates, and your input is valued and important. And this is just one of the beginning steps in doing it. There's many more opportunities for you to be involved, and we look forward to hearing from you more in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lily. I want to thank all of our presenters and all of the staff and consultant team that were getting questions answered behind the team. But most importantly, we want to thank you for coming out and for sharing your thoughtful and insightful comments and suggestions on how the county can make progress on achieving an approved housing element and a safety element. So with that, we thank you again, and we are adjourned for the evening. Good night.